History books call him a monster, a savage warlord who bathed the northern snows in blood. But the truth, hidden deep within the Belmont family archives, tells a profoundly different story. What happens when a cruel father offers his cursed, discarded daughter as sheep to the slaughter and the wolf bows? The year was 1243, and the realm of Ethelgard was bleeding. The southern valleys, rich in grain and gold, had spent a decade fighting a losing war against the northern reach. The north was a harsh, unforgiving land of jagged mountains, endless pine forests, and freezing mists. But it wasn't the terrain that terrified the southerners. It was the men who ruled it. The Lycans. Shifters. Werewolves. At the helm of this terrifying northern army was King Eric Harlaw. He was an alpha of terrifying renown, a man whose sheer size and ferocity on the battlefield had earned him the moniker the Crimson Hound. When Eric's forces finally breached the Riverlands, the southern lords had no choice but to sue for peace. The terms were simple, brutal, and customary for the era, an alliance sealed by blood. Lord Reginald Belmont, the wealthiest and most influential of the southern lords, was ordered to surrender his eldest daughter, Isolde, to be the Alpha King's bride. Isolde was the jewel of the South, golden-haired, charismatic, and bred for queenship. But Lord Reginald was a man of boundless ambition and equally boundless deceit. He could not stomach the thought of giving his prized Isolde to a savage. He had already been secretly negotiating a marriage for Isolde with a powerful neighboring king to the east. Giving her to Auric would ruin his ultimate plan for southern domination. So, Reginald devised a treacherous plot. He would send his other daughter, the one society did not speak of, the one whose name was a hushed curse in the halls of the Belmont estate, Eleanor. Eleanor Belmont was born during the rare astrological anomaly known as the blood eclipse. In the superstitious southern courts, this was considered a profound ill omen, but it was her appearance that sealed her fate. While the rest of the Belmonts boasted golden hair and sun-kissed skin, Eleanor was born with hair as stark white as bone and eyes the color of a stormy sea. Furthermore, she bore a strange, branching birthmark over her left collarbone, a mark the local priests declared the touch of the fiend. Her mother died in childbirth, cementing the belief that Eleanor was a bringer of death. For 19 years, she was hidden away in the highest, draftiest tower of the Belmont Manor, treated worse than a scullery maid. She was given barely enough food to survive, dressed in threadbare garments, and taught to keep her eyes on the floor. She was the family's dark, shameful secret. When the summons from the north arrived, Reginald's guards dragged Eleanor from her tower in the dead of night. They scrubbed her raw, forced her into a heavy, suffocating wedding gown of crimson velvet Isolde's gown, tailored poorly to fit Eleanor's emaciated frame, and threw a thick, opaque veil over her head. "You will keep this veil on," Lord Reginald hissed, gripping her fragile chin through the fabric. "You will not speak. You will let the beast take you. If he kills you, as he surely will when he discovers my deception, your death will give the South the righteous cause we need to unite the Eastern kingdoms and wipe his kind from the earth. Do not fail me in this one miserable thing, Eleanor. Bleed for your family." Eleanor trembled, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew what this was, a suicide mission. She was being sent as a sacrificial lamb to infuriate a monster. The journey north took 3 grueling weeks. Eleanor was locked inside a reinforced ironwood carriage, escorted by 50 of her father's most ruthless knights, led by a cruel captain named Cord. She spent the days shivering in the cold, clutching the heavy crimson velvet to her chest. She had never known kindness, but the terror of what awaited her at the end of the road was a different, sharper kind of agony. She had heard the stories. The Lycan King tore men limb from limb. He drank blood from the skulls of his enemies. What would he do to a frail, cursed girl who had been sent as a deliberate insult? When the carriage finally crossed the treacherous mountain pass and descended into the northern reach, the temperature plummeted. Eleanor peeked through the slats of the carriage windows, her breath fogging the frosty glass. Imposing blackstone fortresses jutted out of the snowy landscape like the teeth of a dead god. Finally, they arrived at Harlaw Keep, a massive, brooding citadel carved directly into the side of a mountain. The gates groaned open, revealing a courtyard filled with towering, muscle-bound warriors wrapped in thick furs. Their eyes glowing with unnatural hues of amber, gold, and ice blue tracked the southern carriage with predatory stillness. Captain Cord barked orders, and the carriage door was yanked open. The freezing northern wind bit into Eleanor's skin as she was hauled out. Her legs were weak from malnutrition and the long journey, and she stumbled, almost falling into the slush. A chorus of low, rumbling growls echoed through the courtyard. "Stand up, you useless creature," Cord muttered under his breath, yanking her upright by her arm. "Remember your orders." She was marched up the imposing stone steps, through towering doors of iron and oak, and into the great hall of Harlaw. The room was cavernous, lit by roaring hearths that cast long, dancing shadows against the tapestries. Hundreds of northern lords and lichen warriors lined the hall. The air was thick with the scent of pine, wood smoke, and an overwhelming primal dominance that made Eleanor's knees buckle. At the far end of the hall, seated upon a throne of dark ironwood and wolf pelts, was King Eric Harlaw. Eleanor dared not look up. Her veiled head remained bowed as Captain Cord shoved her forward into the center of the room. "King Eric," Cord announced, his voice echoing, though Eleanor could hear the slight tremor of fear in his tone. "Lord Reginald Belmont honors the treaty. He presents to you his flesh and blood, the bride of the South." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the hall. It was a silence so profound that Eleanor could hear the crackle of the fire and the terrified, erratic beating of her own heart. Then, the king stood. The sound of Eric's boots on the stone steps echoed like thunderclaps in the quiet hall. He descended from the dais slowly, deliberately. Through the sheer mesh of her veil, Eleanor caught glimpses of him. He was a leviathan of a man, broad-shouldered, standing well over 6.5 feet tall, clad in dark leather armor and heavy dark furs. His hair was pitch black, falling just past his shoulders, and his jaw was covered in a rugged scruff. But it was his aura that was truly terrifying, a suffocating wave of power and authority that seemed to press the very oxygen out of the room. He stopped a mere 2 feet in front of her. The heat radiating from his massive body was palpable in the freezing hall. "Lord Belmont sends his daughter." Eric's voice was a deep, gravelly baritone that seemed to vibrate through the stone floor and straight into Eleanor's bones. And yet, he sends her shrouded in secrecy. "It is a southern custom, Your Grace." Cord lied smoothly, though he took a cautious step back. "A bride must remain veiled until the husband claims her." Onik let out a sound that was half scoff, half growl. "We are not in the South, Captain. Here, we look our fate in the eyes." Before Cord could protest, Eric reached out. His large, calloused hand, clad in a fingerless leather gauntlet, grasped the top of the heavy crimson veil. With a single, swift motion, he tore it away. The collective gasp from the northern court sucked the air from the room. Eleanor squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the blow. She waited for the furious roar, the sound of tearing flesh, the agonizing pain of a lichen's claws ripping through her throat. She knew how she looked. Her bone-white hair cascaded in chaotic, unkempt waves down her back. Her skin was deathly pale, marred by exhaustion and the dark circles under her eyes. And the gown Isolda's gown hung off her frail shoulders, drooping low enough to expose the twisted, branching birthmark on her collarbone. She was an insult made flesh, a cursed thing standing in a hall of apex predators. "Treachery!" shouted Garrick, Arik's hulking beta, stepping forward with his hand resting on the hilt of a massive broadsword. "This is not the golden-haired Isolda. Belmont has sent us a sickly ghost, an insult to the crown. My king, give the word and I will take this captain's head and the girls alongside it." The hall erupted into snarls and shouts. The lichens were furious, their eyes flashing with primal rage. Captain Cord drew his sword, and his men formed a defensive ring. Eleanor collapsed to her knees, burying her face in her hands, trembling violently. "This is it," she thought. "This is the end." Silence. Eric's roar shook the dust from the rafters. The word was laced with an alpha command so potent that even the southern knights dropped their weapons, falling to their knees against their will. The hall fell instantly, terrifyingly quiet. Eleanor peeked through her fingers. King Eric had not drawn his weapon. He had not transformed into a beast. Instead, he was staring down at her, completely motionless. His chest heaved as he drew in a deep, long breath through his nose. He was scenting her. To the lichens, scent was everything. It told them a person's health, their emotions, their deepest truths. Eleanor smelled of fear, yes, but beneath the terror, beneath the scent of the long, dirty road and the stale velvet gown, there was something else. A scent of winter frost, crushed moonflowers, and rain-slicked stones. Eric's ice-blue eyes widened. The primal fury that had been building in his chest evaporated, replaced by a shock so profound it left him staggered. The legends spoke of it, but few ever experienced it. the snapping of the soul tether, the absolute undeniable recognition of the fates. Mate, Eric fell to one knee, matching Eleanor's level. The movement sent another shockwave of gasps through the court. The Alpha King bowed to no one, yet here he was, kneeling before a shivering, emaciated southern girl. He reached out, his massive hands incredibly gentle as they hovered over her trembling shoulders. "Look at me," he commanded, though the harshness was entirely gone from his voice. It was a plea. Eleanor, terrified to disobey, slowly lifted her head. Her stormy gray eyes locked with his piercing ice-blue ones. For a moment, the entire world melted away. There was no cold, no fear, no cruel father. There was only the intense, burning heat in the king's eyes, a look not of disgust, but of absolute, consuming awe. "You," Eric breathed, his voice barely a whisper, yet carrying through the silent hall. He gently brushed a lock of white hair from her face, his thumb grazing her hollow cheek. "You are starving." Eleanor blinked, completely thrown by the observation. She opened her mouth to speak, but her throat was so dry, no sound came out. Eric stood, his demeanor instantly shifting from tender awe to terrifying, lethal protectiveness. He turned to face Captain Cord, who was sweating profusely. "You brought her to me in this condition," Eric said, his voice dropping into a deadly, rumbling octave. "You starved my queen." She is a cursed thing, Your Grace," Cord stammered, realizing the plan had gone horribly wrong. Lord Reginald is a dead man walking," Eric interrupted, his fangs briefly elongating as he snarled. "But you are in my hall right now." In a blur of motion too fast for the human eye to track, Arik crossed the distance. His hand locked around Cord's throat, lifting the armored man entirely off the ground. Cord kicked and choked, but Eric's grip was iron. "Return to your cowardly lord," Eric growled, tossing Cord violently to the floor like a broken toy. Cord gasped for air, scrambling backward. "Tell him I accept his tribute. Tell him King Eric Harlaw claims the white-haired daughter as his fated mate, his queen, and the High Lady of the North. And tell him," Eric's eyes flared a glowing demonic gold, "that when I ride south in the spring, I will not be coming for peace. I will be coming to burn his estate to the ground for the 19 years of torment he inflicted upon my soul's other half. Run." Cord and his men didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled out of the hall, fleeing into the snowy night. Eric turned back to Eleanor. The golden fire in his eyes receded back to a soft, human blue. He removed his heavy fur cloak and draped it over her trembling shoulders. The warmth and his scent pine, leather, and safety enveloped her. Gently, effortlessly, he scooped her into his arms. "Garrick," Eric called out over his shoulder as he carried Eleanor toward the royal wing. "Summon the healers, have a warm bath drawn, and bring a feast to my chambers. My queen is home." The royal chambers of Harlaw Keep were larger than the entire floor of the tower Eleanor had lived in for 19 years. A massive four-poster bed draped in thick pelts dominated the room. A roaring fire crackled in a hearth large enough to stand inside. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, freshly bathed and dressed in a soft woolen tunic that belonged to Eric. The healers had come and gone, muttering over her bruises and malnutrition, applying sweet-smelling salves to her cracked skin. A table before her groaned under the weight of roasted meats, fresh bread, and steaming broth. Eric sat in a heavy chair across the room, watching her. He hadn't pushed her to speak. He hadn't demanded anything of her. He just watched her with a quiet, intense devotion that made Eleanor's head spin. She took a small, hesitant bite of the bread. It was the softest, richest thing she had ever tasted. Tears welled up in her eyes, spilling over her cheeks before she could stop them. Arik was by her side in a fraction of a second. "Are you in pain?" he asked, panic briefly breaking through his stoic demeanor. "No," she croaked, finding her voice for the first time since leaving the South. Her voice was raspy, unused. I don't understand." "What is there to understand, little bird?" he asked softly, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed, maintaining a respectful distance. "My father," she whispered, looking down at her hands. "He sent me here to die. I am cursed. I bring famine and ruin. You were supposed to be insulted. You were supposed to kill me." A low rumble vibrated in Eric's chest. "Your father is a fool who could not recognize a diamond if he stepped on it. There is no curse on you, Eleanor." She flinched at her name. "You know my name?" "I know everything about you that the wind carried north," Eric replied. "I know they locked you away. I know they feared your white hair and your mark. But they are blind. fearful humans. He reached out, gently touching the edge of her collar, right over the branching birthmark. Do you know what this mark means among my people? Eleanor shook her head, terrified. It is the mark of the Frost Weaver, an ancient lineage of Lycan mystics, long thought lost. Your mother. Was she from the deep woods? Eleanor blinked, trying to remember the vague whispers of the servants. She was a northerner. My father took her as a prize during the first border skirmishes. She died when I was born. Eric nodded slowly, the pieces falling into place. You are half Lycan, Eleanor. The white hair, the mark. You are not a cursed human. You are a sacred child of the winter moon, and you are my mate. Eleanor couldn't process it. For 19 years, she was a monster, a demon. Now, this terrifying warlord was telling her she was sacred? A mate? She asked softly. The other half of my soul, Eric explained, his voice thick with emotion. Lycans do not marry for politics, though we play the games of men when we must. We are bound by the fates. When I smelled your scent, I knew. I would burn the entire world to ash before I let anyone harm you again. The absolute sincerity in his eyes terrified her more than any threat. How could she trust this? How could she suddenly go from a disposable piece of trash to the center of a king's universe? Over the next few weeks, the political reality of Eric's choice began to set in. The northern lords were uneasy. Though they respected the mating bond, taking a fragile, untested, half-southern girl as their queen on the eve of a potential massive war with the South was a bitter pill to swallow. Whispers echoed through the stone corridors of Harlaw Keep. She is too weak to breed. She will break in the first winter. Belmont played the king for a fool, mate or not. Eleanor heard the whispers. She spent her days wandering the massive keep, accompanied always by Garrick or a detail of royal guards. She noticed the side eyes, the muttered comments. Despite Eric's absolute devotion to her in private, he slept on the floor beside the bed, refusing to touch her until she was comfortable and healed. She felt the heavy burden of her perceived inadequacy. Then came the night of the Blood Moon Festival. It was a northern tradition, a night of wild celebration, feasting, and primal displays of strength in the main courtyard. Eleanor sat beside Arik on the high dais, swathed in white furs that made her silver hair gleam like starlight. She was slowly gaining weight, color returning to her cheeks, but she still felt profoundly out of place among the towering, boisterous Lycans. Midway through the feast, a southern envoy arrived at the gates under a banner of truce. They were granted entry. It was a small delegation, led by a man Eleanor recognized instantly, Lord Halem, one of her father's most cunning advisors. Halem stepped forward, bowing deeply to King Eric, though his eyes lingered maliciously on Eleanor. King Eric, Halem announced smoothly. Lord Reginald sends his. Apologies for the misunderstanding of the tribute. However, the South cannot accept a half-breed bastard sitting as a symbol of our treaty. Lord Reginald offers a trade. Return the girl to us, and we will send Isolde, the true bride, along with 10 wagons of gold. Keep her, and the treaty is void. War will begin at first thaw. The courtyard went dead silent. The northern lords looked at Eric. 10 wagons of gold and a true political hostage could secure their borders for a generation. Eric didn't even blink. Tell Reginald to ready his armies. The queen stays. Halem's smile was thin and poisonous. As you wish, your grace, but might I present a gift to the queen, from her loving sister Isolde? A token of farewell. Halem signaled to a servant, who brought forward a beautiful, ornate silver goblet filled with southern spiced wine. The servant walked up the steps of the dais, offering it to Eleanor. Eleanor reached out, her hand trembling. She looked at the dark red liquid. She knew her family. She knew Isolde. There was no love here. As her fingers brushed the cold silver of the goblet, her Lycan heritage dormant and suppressed by 19 years of starvation suddenly flared to life. The scent of the wine hit her nose, and underneath the heavy spices, she smelled it. Wolfsbane. Refined, concentrated, deadly. In a fraction of a second, before the servant could react, Eleanor stood up. Instead of taking the goblet, she struck it with the back of her hand. The silver cup clattered to the stone floor, the poisoned wine burning a sizzling hole into the expensive rug on the dais. The entire courtyard gasped as the acrid smoke of the poison rose into the air. Eric was on his feet in an instant, a monstrous roar tearing from his throat. Garrick and the guards seized Halem and his men, pressing them into the dirt. Eleanor stood tall, her chest heaving, her stormy gray eyes flashing with a sudden brilliant ring of silver light. The timid, broken girl from the tower was gone, replaced by something ancient and fierce. She looked down at Halem, her voice carrying a strange, dual-toned resonance that echoed through the silent courtyard. "Tell my father," Eleanor said, her words dripping with newfound authority, "that the cursed daughter is dead. I am Eleanor of Harlaw, Queen of the Northern Reach, and if he ever sends poison into my home again, I will not wait for the spring thaw to rip out his throat." The Northern lords, previously skeptical and whispering, stared in absolute stunned silence. Then, slowly, Beta Garrick drew his sword and slammed the hilt against his chest armor in a sharp salute. One by one, the massive Lycan warriors followed suit. The metallic clash of armor rang out, a deafening drumbeat of respect and loyalty. They had wanted a strong queen. They had just found her. Eric looked at Eleanor, his chest swelling with an immense, uncontainable pride. He reached out, taking her hand, and raised it high into the freezing night air as the wolves of the north threw back their heads and howled for their new queen. According to the translated Caldwell Harlaw manuscripts, discovered centuries later in a private vault in Geneva, the winter of 1243 was unlike any other recorded in Aethelgard's history. It was later dubbed the Queen's Breath. As the Northern Reach prepared for an all-out war against the Southern Valleys, Eleanor was undergoing a grueling, agonizing transformation. The poison incident at the Blood Moon Festival had triggered her dormant Lycan genes, but because her human father's blood fought against her mother's ancient Deep Woods lineage, the transition nearly killed her. For 3 weeks, Eleanor lay in the royal chambers, gripped by violently fluctuating fevers. Eric refused to leave her side. He handed command of the marching legions to Beta Garrick and Commander Leif, choosing instead to bathe Eleanor's burning skin in ice water and coax drops of broth past her cracked lips. During the darkest night of her fever, the historical texts note a phenomenon that defied explanation. The hearth fires in the royal wing turned a brilliant, glowing sapphire, and frost crept up the stone walls in intricate, branching patterns mirroring the exact shape of the birthmark on Eleanor's collarbone. When Eleanor finally awoke, her stormy gray eyes had permanently shifted. They now held a striking, luminescent silver ring around the iris. She was no longer the frail, starved girl locked in a tower. The Frostweaver bloodline had fully awakened. She didn't shift into a wolf like the others. Her power was older, more primal. She could manipulate the ambient temperature, pulling the moisture from the air to create barriers of hardened ice, or dropping the temperature of a room until men's breaths turned to snowflakes. "You are a terrifying beauty, little bird," Eric murmured the first time he watched her casually freeze a goblet of water just by brushing her fingertips against the silver rim. "I am no longer a bird, Eric," Eleanor replied, her voice carrying a calm, chilling authority. "I am the winter storm, and it is time we bring the storm to my father." Down in the southern valleys, Lord Reginald Belmont was not sitting idle. Panic had seized the southern courts when the severed heads of Halem's delegation were returned in a cart, packed in magical, unmelting ice. Reginald knew the Alpha King was coming, but he arrogantly believed he could outsmart a beast. Secret letters recently unearthed from the Valois estate reveal that Reginald bankrolled a ruthless mercenary company known as the Iron Vipers, led by a notorious tactician named Commander Gideon Croft. Croft brought with him a terrifying arsenal: heavy ballistas retrofitted with pure silver harpoons, and nets woven with thick steel and wolfsbane ash. Reginald also executed a desperate political maneuver. He forced Isolde into a hasty, unconsummated marriage with Duke Alistair of the Eastern Marches, effectively dragging the Eastern armies into his defense. By the time the first spring thaw was supposed to break, Belmont Manor was fortified by 10,000 heavily armed men, a fortress of stone and silver waiting to slaughter the wolves. But the thaw never came. Eleanor rode at the vanguard of the Lycan army, seated upon a massive black destrier beside Auric in his monstrous 9-foot-tall Lycan form. As they marched south, the snow marched with them. Eleanor pushed her power outward, blanketing the usually temperate southern fields in blinding blizzards and freezing fogs. Commander Croft's strategies relied on clear visibility to fire the silver harpoons. Eleanor blinded them. The eastern armies, unaccustomed to such bitter cold, found their bowstrings snapping and their armor freezing to their skin. When the northern army finally breached the tree lines surrounding the sprawling Belmont estate, it was not a battle. It was a slaughter. Eric and his Lycan shock troops poured over the defensive trenches like a tidal wave of fur, muscle, and fangs. The silver nets were useless. Eleanor stood upon a ridge overlooking the battlefield, raising her hands to the sky. Sleet rained down in horizontal, flesh-tearing sheets, snapping the mechanisms of the ballistas before they could fire a single shot. Eric, a blur of crimson and black, tore through the iron vipers. He didn't just fight, he orchestrated a symphony of violence, his roars directing his packs to flank and crush the Eastern cavalry. He was a force of nature, driven by an unyielding desire to eradicate the house that had tortured his mate. Within 4 hours, the Southern resistance broke. Commander Croft was found crushed beneath his own ruined siege engine. Duke Alistair fled into the woods, abandoning Isolde and his new alliance entirely. The mighty Belmont Manor, a symbol of wealth and arrogance for 3 centuries, was surrounded by thousands of bloodied, snarling lichens. The heavy oak doors of the manor were blown off their hinges by Beta Garrick. Eric, shifting back to his human form and throwing a dark fur cloak over his blood-slicked shoulders, stepped into the grand foyer. Right behind him, walking with the grace of an apex predator, was Queen Eleanor. The grand ballroom of the Belmont estate was exactly as Eleanor remembered it. Gilded ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and walls adorned with portraits of golden-haired ancestors. But now, the polished marble floors were muddied by the boots of lichen warriors, and the air smelled of blood and terror. Lord Reginald and Isolde were backed against the grand staircase, surrounded by the trembling remnants of their personal guard. Reginald looked haggard, his velvet robes disheveled. Isolde wept openly, her perfect golden hair plastered to her tear-stained face. When the lichens parted to let Eric and Eleanor through, Reginald's eyes widened in sheer disbelief. He stared at his discarded, cursed daughter. She wore form-fitting northern leather and a cloak of pure white fox fur. The strange branching mark on her collarbone pulsed with a faint, icy blue light. She looked radiant, powerful, and utterly lethal. Eleanor. Reginald breathed, dropping his sword. It clattered loudly against the marble. "Kneel," Beta Garrick barked, slamming the butt of his spear into the back of a Southern guard's knees. Reginald, driven by self-preservation, dropped to his knees. He grabbed Isolde's wrist and yanked her down beside him. "King Eric, please," Reginald begged, his arrogance completely shattered. "I yield. The South is yours. I will give you everything. The gold, the lands, the shipping ports. I offer you Isolde. Take her as a concubine, take her as a slave. Just spare my life." Isolde gasped, looking at her father in absolute horror. "Father, you promised me a crown." Eric let out a low, vibrating growl that shook the crystal above them. He stepped forward, his eyes flashing gold. "You offer me the scraps of your cowardice. You starved my soul's mate. You sent poison into my home. And now you attempt to sell the daughter you favored to save your own pathetic neck." Eric drew a massive black iron hunting knife from his belt. "Your gold means nothing to the dead, Reginald." Eric lunged, fully intending to separate Reginald's head from his shoulders. "Eric's." "Stop." Eleanor's voice was not a shout, but the sheer, icy command in it froze Eric in his tracks. His blade stopped mere inches from Reginald's throat. Eric looked back at his queen, the murderous rage in his eyes softening instantly as he deferred to her. This was her house, her trauma, her justice. Eleanor slowly walked toward her father and sister. The ambient temperature in the room plummeted so drastically that the breath of the captured guards plumed in the air, and frost rapidly webbed across the gilded mirrors. She stood over Reginald, looking down at the man who had locked her in the dark for 19 years. "You thought I was a curse," Eleanor said, her voice echoing with that strange, ancient resonance. "You thought my mother's blood was a stain you could hide in the attic. You were wrong, father. I was the only true power this dying family had left." "Eleanor, please," Isolde sobbed, reaching out to grasp the hem of Eleanor's cloak. "We are sisters. We share blood. I didn't want to send the poison. Halem made me do it." Eleanor looked at Isolde, her silver-ringed eyes devoid of pity. "Do not lie to me, Isolde. I can smell the malice on you from here. You wanted the Alpha King dead because you could not bear the thought that the freak of the family wore a crown while you were sold off to a minor duke." Eleanor stepped back, raising her hand. The branching mark on her skin flared brilliantly. With a sharp flick of her wrist, a thick, impenetrable wall of solid, jagged ice erupted from the floorboard, encasing the grand staircase and shattering the Belmont family crest mounted above it. "I am Eleanor Harlaw, Frost Weaver of the Deep Woods, and Queen of the Northern Reach," she proclaimed, her voice ringing with absolute finality. "And I am not like you. I do not slaughter the defenseless." Reginald let out a pathetic gasp of relief, thinking he was spared. "But you will not live here," Eleanor continued, her gaze turning to steel. This estate now belongs to the crown. All Belmont titles are stripped. All your gold is seized to feed the orphans of this war. You, Reginald, and you, Isolde, are banished to the desolate penal colonies of the jagged eastern coast. You will live the rest of your days farming rocks in the freezing rain. You will know what it means to be cold. You will know what it means to be starved. And you will know what it means to be forgotten. Reginald's face went pale. The eastern penal colonies were a death sentence of slow, agonizing labor. No, no, Eleanor, you cannot do this. Kill me. Just kill me. Garrick, Eric ordered, ignoring the pathetic man's pleas. Strip them of their silks, give them burlap, put them in chains, and march them east. As the northern guards dragged a screaming Isolde and a broken Reginald out of the manor, Eleanor finally let out a long, shuddering breath. The icy glow faded from her eyes, and the temperature in the room slowly began to normalize. She felt a heavy, warm hand on her shoulder. Eric pulled her against his chest, wrapping his arms securely around her waist, resting his chin on the top of her white hair. "It is over, little bird," he whispered, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Not a bird," she reminded him softly, leaning into his solid, comforting warmth. "No," Eric agreed, a deep smile rumbling in his chest. "A queen. My queen." Historical archives, specifically the Oakhaven Decrees signed in 1245, show that Ethelgard was ultimately united under the banner of the Wolf and the Winter. Eleanor did not rule with cruelty, but with a fierce, protective grace that the continent had never seen. She rebuilt the southern farms, merged the northern and southern cultures, and established a lineage of Lycanfrost weavers that guarded the realm for 400 years. Lord Reginald and Isolde Belmont faded into total obscurity, their names erased from the noble registries, dying as nameless peasants on a freezing, rocky shore, a poetic, brutal justice orchestrated by the daughter they once deemed too broken to love. History often rewrites villains and heroes, hiding the most breathtaking truths in dusty archives. Eleanor Belmont wasn't a cursed tragedy. She was the dormant storm that brought an empire to its knees, proving that the ones society throws away are often the ones destined to rule it. If you loved uncovering the truth behind the Alpha King and his Frostweaver Queen, hit that like button, share this story with your fellow romance and fantasy lovers, and subscribe for more epic, untold historical dramas.